So I've watched a lot of Shakespearean productions on in, on TV, on stage, in movies. Lots of tragedies: Julius Caesar, Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth, um, Hamlet, of course. My favorite is Othello. There's something just basic about Othello. I mean, it's about jealousy, revenge. It's very passionate. It's initially set in Venice. In fact, the official title is The Tragedy of Othello, Moor of Venice, and um, and it's got great characters, but in particular, I think it of all the Shakespearean adaptations or Shakespearean plays, this one features two leading roles that are so equal and interesting, particularly two male, leading roles. The role of Othello, the title character, and Iago. And Othello is this Moor, so usually played by either a black actor or certainly back in the old days, white actors in blackface. But he's like the general of men. He's this leader. He's very sort of noble and highly regarded and respected. Iago is one of his soldiers who's passed up for promotion. He gets jealous. There's probably something more deep-seated than that, but it spurs him on to a mission of revenge against Othello and other people. And it's a real showcase for whoever's portraying, especially those two characters. And so I love it. It's a really passionate story. As I say, it begins in Venice, but most of it takes place in Cyprus. And so, of the on-screen adaptations I've seen about 6 of them. And I haven't seen any plays, unfortunately. There's a lot of versions I wish I could have seen. I wish I could have seen Chiwetel Ejiofor as Othello, and there's still time. He could someday play him on screen sometime. I'd love to see Dominic West as Iago. I've heard great things about that. Back in the early 80s, there was a highly regarded version with James Earl Jones as Othello. I mean, can you imagine that? Who better than James Earl Jones as Othello? But opposite him was Christopher Plummer. And from everything I've heard, I mean, I already know Christopher Plummer was a great Shakespearean actor. I've watched his version of Hamlet, and he's excellent. But from everything I've heard, he's one of the greatest Iagos of all time. So I would love to have seen that one filmed, but it never happened, at least as far as I know. So I'm going to go over the 6 productions that I have seen and do a little analysis of them. In 1951, Orson Welles directed a version of Othello where he plays Othello and Michael McLemore plays Iago. A very famous version in 1965 with Laurence Olivier as Othello, and Frank Finlay plays Iago. Both were nominated for Academy Awards that year for their performances. There were 2 from the early 80s that I've also seen. This one with William Marshall as Othello and Ron Moody as Iago. Also, Jenny Agutter plays Desdemona. And I believe it was the same year, a version with Anthony Hopkins as Othello and Bob Hoskins as Iago. In 1990, there's a version with Ian McKellen famously playing Iago. to much acclaim, and Willard White as Othello. And Imogen Stubbs actually plays Desdemona in this version. And the most recent one, of course, that I've seen was from the 90s. I want to say 1995, featuring Lawrence Fishburne as Othello, Kenneth Branagh as Iago, and Irene Jacob as Desdemona. Now, I want to go in chronological order, so I'm going to begin with 1941's Othello, directed by Orson Welles. Now, with Orson Welles, it's actually, I think, a pretty great performance. He looks kind of amazing as the Moor. Yes, he's in blackface, and to be honest, I was always uncomfortable with that. Not just because it's woke today or politically correct, but I've always had a little bit of an issue with it. But the film is in black and white, and the makeup is a bit subtle, so it really just looks like Orson Welles had a tan, you know. But between the hair, the beard, the tan, the imposing presence, and that great voice of his, he actually is a pretty striking Othello. It really gives a great performance. But we have Michael McLemore as Iago, as I mentioned before. This is the biggest problem I have. Michael McLemore, I mean, nothing against the guy. I'm not sure what else he's ever done. I'm not sure if I've ever seen him in anything else, but he's pretty underwhelming as Iago. It's it's a pretty short movie for a Shakespeare adaptation, because any Shakespeare tragedy, if you film the whole thing, it's going to be 3-4 hours long. This is 93 minutes, or somewhere about 90 minutes or more, and that makes for a pretty short Shakespearean tragedy. So there's a lot of stuff cut. And I suppose perhaps a lot of soliloquies or whatever from Iago. But Iago should be a scene stealer. Iago should be a really juicy role, and at the very least, should have equal screen presence to the actor playing Othello. In fact, if done right, Iago really should steal the whole film or production. And in this case, it's the other way around. Macklemore is so weak, in my opinion, so underwhelming that it's a bit of a disappointment. Now, as I say, it's a shorter version. It's the shortest version of Othello, maybe ever. It's like 97 minutes or something like that. So you're not going to get the complete text. But what this movie does have going for it is it's incredibly stylish. I mean, every Orson Welles directed film has a certain style to it. The cinematography, the use of light and shadow is really fantastic. It's in filmmaking standards, it's a beautiful looking film. But now it's time to talk about the 1965 version of Othello, featuring Laurence Olivier. In the case of Laurence Olivier, the makeup is not subtle. It's still a very striking figure. There's something about the dark skin and the red kind of eyes that are definitely kind of electric to look at, especially with the vibrant colors of the production. And Olivier, of course, was a brilliant actor, so he is eminently watchable in this film. He's got an interesting accent where I think he's sort of rolling his R's, and it's a you say what you will, uh, but he's definitely you can't take your eyes off of Olivier in this version from 1965. Now, Frank Finlay as Iago, again, this is where I have kind of an issue. Iago, as I say, he's a scene stealer. Iago is a schemer. He's villainous. But in order for his evil plan to work, he has to be charismatic. He has to be likable. He has to be somebody everyone can trust because everyone does trust him. Othello trusts him. Roderigo trusts him. Cassio, Desdemona. Everybody trusts good old honest Iago. So you really have to play him as seemingly trustworthy. Nothing is trustworthy about Frank Finlay's performance in this movie. He slithers across the stage. And I mean, even when he's by himself, he seems, when he's by himself or when he's with other people, people he's supposed to be, friends with and acting friendly and helpful, he just seems sinister. Why would anybody trust this guy? That's not how you should play Iago. You should play Iago as an actor. Iago is an actor. He acts like he's a trustworthy guy. If Frank Finlay's version of Iago were to, if I was to walk past him in an alley, I'd check my back pocket to see if my wallet is still there because you just cannot trust this guy. He seems weaselly. He seems snake-like. I know he was nominated for an Oscar, and he had a lot of acclaim for his performance, as did Olivier at the time. It's just the wrong take. Now he's an excellent actor. He's actually my favorite Ghost of Jacob Marley of all time. He was in the 1984 version with George C. Scott as Scrooge of A Christmas Carol. So he's a terrific actor, and he's got a great voice, and his presence is very, he's got a great, stage presence and screen presence. So while his performance is good in and of itself, it's good as an overtly evil character, not good as an evil character who should seemingly be trustworthy. Now, I I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit more about how problematic it is that Olivier is in, pretty obvious blackface. It's it's just the way it was at the time. No excuses. As I say, even when I was watching this as a younger man, I just felt uneasy about any white actor in blackface. I just couldn't understand why not hire a black actor or cast a black actor in the role. So it is problematic. No escaping that. And not just the blackface, but the mannerisms that Olivier adapts. It does make it still watchable because he was such a great actor, and certainly at the time was considered one of the greatest actors of his century. So there's a reason for that. He was a great actor, and so he made the role certainly watchable, as I mentioned before. The other issue with this Othello that I don't love is how simple the sets are. The director decided to use a very minimalist style, and I think I even read somewhere that the reason he did that was he wanted audiences to concentrate on the performances. But that's silly. I mean, you can still have a handsome production and still be focused on the great performances. I mean, if the performances are good enough, you shouldn't have to worry about the audience being distracted by great sets and great costumes. So it all felt a bit stagey. And speaking of stagey, time to move on to the next film, which is really the next couple of them are going to be television films. But they were televised from stage productions. And the first I will talk about, all these or these next two are basically from 1981. So the first one I want to talk about is the William Marshall, Ron Moody version. And in the early 80s, we have William Marshall, whom many remember as playing Blackula. I think that was in the 70s. Well, he actually has played Othello on stage quite a bit, from what I understand, or had played Othello, including in, I believe, the 60s, but certainly the 70s. And I would love to have seen him then. I mean, it's apparently to great acclaim at the time. But I must say, in this early 80s version, I mean, I kind of hate to say it. I don't want to seem ageist, but he was a little long in the tooth in this version. Um, and he had William Marshall, a naturally deep voice, but it sure seemed like in this production he tried to go even deeper with his voice. And I don't know if it was the actual audio from the video that I watched. It was a VHS at the time, or if it was just the way it was recorded, or if it was just him. But it's very hard to understand the Shakespearean dialogue when he was going so deep with his voice. And I mentioned Ron Moody as Iago. Now, Ron Moody he was a great actor. I believe he played Fagin in the musical adaptation of Oliver Twist called Oliver. And obviously he was in a lot of other things. He's actually quite good. It's an excellent performance as Iago, but the problem is, and again, I kind of hate to mention this because you know, it's not like he had a choice here, but he just kind of looks like an evil guy. He's got the kind of sunken in eyes, the bald head, and he's just kind of he's kind of typecast usually as villainous characters because of how he looks. So again, I feel like it's a little counterproductive for the actual character of Iago. Just because we know the character is evil doesn't mean he should look evil or overtly act evil. Now, I will say, Moody doesn't seem to be overtly acting evil, but he can't help his face, unfortunately. Honestly, not much more to say about that one, and so I'll move on to the next 1981 production with Anthony Hopkins and Bob Hoskins. Anthony Hopkins here plays the Moor. Again, in blackface, but it is, I will say, subtle blackface. They really didn't want to go too dark with it. And Bob Hoskins, very interestingly, plays Iago. And this is sort of the opposite situation here because, Anthony Hopkins, as we all know, is a great actor. And at this point in time, he was very much considered a Shakespearean actor, but he was a last minute replacement because it was supposed to be James Earl Jones in this particular production. But I think, from what I understand, there was an issue with James Earl Jones's passport, so he couldn't make it to London. So in the last minute, they got Anthony Hopkins, and Hopkins gives, I'll just call it an interesting performance as Othello. Very sort of eccentric, kind of wild in a way. There are moments that are really, I think he really gives a nice performance here and there at certain times, but mostly it's just kind of a weird performance, for lack of a better word, and maybe it's due to a little bit of a lack of preparation. I'm not sure, but the real scene stealer here is Bob Hoskins, and it's a little bit of a surprise because he was never really a Shakespearean actor. He's a Cockney Londoner, who's a very naturalistic actor, and yet he really gives kind of a blue collar presence to Iago. And unlike pretty much any other version of Iago, his is he's got a screw loose. Like, he is not all there. And he really portrays an Iago who, is a little bit insane, sort of giggling to himself, and and so it's interesting because when he's laughing with other people, it seems like he's a great guy, and he's just sort of, you know being real friendly with his with his friends. And then you realize when he starts laughing by himself, oh, wait, there's something wrong with this guy. And that is such an interesting take on Iago. And at least in this production, it really, really works. Uh, I must say, Hoskins is probably the best thing about this production of Othello. Yeah. So again, Hoskins is great. Hopkins, interesting. It's a handsome production. Like you can tell, the sets are terrific. The costumes, they really, tried to create a nice atmosphere. Can't escape the stagey quality though. There's something stiff about it. I don't know if it needed more sort of orchestral music, more transitions, something to make it feel a little more. I don't know, have a little bit more pacing. It's not very obviously it's not cinematic. It's just a filmed stage production. But it feels a bit stiff. It's not quite exciting. I mean, you can enjoy a couple of the performances, but otherwise, it's it can be the time can drag a little bit when you watch really both these productions. So let me transition now to Ian McKellen and Willard White. Now, I was really interested in watching the 1990 version of Othello, mainly because I just assumed Ian McKellen was going to be awesome as Iago, right? Because I love Ian McKellen in Lord of the Rings, in the X-Men movies, terrific, terrific actor. He apparently was highly acclaimed, won some award for his performance as Iago. And so I just assumed he was going to be great. And because I had never heard of Willard White, that maybe he was going to kind of overwhelm Willard White. And maybe it was going to be one of those situations where, it was going to be all about Iago. But I actually found it to be quite the opposite. Ian McKellen's performance is so over the top in this production. Maybe on stage it would have worked really well, but everything Ian McKellen does seems to be to show off for the camera. I mean, I kind of hate to say it, but it really does seem to be a lot of scenery chewing from him. On the other hand, Willard White, who again I had never heard of, and I think he was a singer. I mean, obviously he's done stage work singing, and so he must have done some acting because he was brilliant. His performance is actually my favorite performance of Othello. He's not a white guy in blackface. That's always helpful. um, but he's got a great voice, as you would imagine, from a guy who's a great sort of. I think he's a bass singer. Um, but the emotion is there too. He's got all the nobility, but he also has the screen presence and the emotions. He was so good as Othello, and sort of surprising. I've never heard anybody really talk much about his performance as Othello. So not only do I have an issue with Ian McKellen's performance in this version of Othello, but I have to talk about the set and the period that they're setting this production in. First of all, it's very minimalist set, much like the 1965 version. There's some, they'll show some bunks, a table or some chairs. It's a very minimalist set. Again, I don't understand why a production that at first is set in Venice and then set in Cyprus, why you wouldn't go with a very handsome production with beautiful costumes and scenery and stuff. But anyway, there you are. Not only that, though, it appears to be set during the American Civil War because they're wearing Civil War uniforms. I guess that's what they're going for. It doesn't work. For me, it just doesn't work. I mean, sometimes it's just best to go with the period that Shakespeare originally intended. I mean, is that so wrong? But anyway, yeah, look. I haven't even talked about the supporting cast. The supporting cast is excellent. You know, the actresses playing Desdemona, playing Bianca, all the actresses, they're wonderful. I'm focused primarily on the two leads in this analysis. And once again, I feel like we have an imbalance. Most of the productions have an imbalance between the actor playing Othello and Iago, and in this case, it's no exception. I'm sure most believe that it's Ian McKellen who's sort of overshadows Willard White. Honestly, for me, it's the other way around. So now it's time to talk about my final screen version of Othello, and it also just happens to be my favorite. Now we come to the 1995 version, and here we have Lawrence Fishburne as kind of a younger Othello. As we know, Fishburne is American. He actually is not a Shakespearean trained actor. Um, and at first, I was on the fence about his performance, but I have grown to quite love his performance over the years because one of the things I thought his character was a bit cocky and kind of a jerk at times, and I wasn't really accustomed to that based on some of the other performances. But now I realize that's not necessarily a bad thing for Othello to have a little bit, have a few negative qualities. He still has great screen presence. He still has nobility. The youth gives him kind of a sexier quality, which makes you understand a little bit more why Desdemona is attracted to the Moor. But yeah, that cockiness that he brings to the character almost invites the trouble that Iago uh, causes them. He doesn't deserve it, and especially Desdemona doesn't deserve it. The this evil plan concocted by Iago. I'm just saying, Fishburne's version of Othello almost invites trouble. Somebody was going to dissent, probably eventually. I just wanted to say a quick word though about Irene Jacob. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. She's a Swiss slash French actress. And at the time, she got quite a lot of criticism for not, for having an accent while delivering her lines. But honestly, she's such a great Desdemona. She really perfectly portrays the innocence of the character. She's the sweetness of the character. She's just nothing but good in this, and your heart really does break for her. And so I think she's a very important component in this production. But I have to talk about Kenneth Branagh. His Iago is everything I would ever want from the character. By the way, he didn't direct this either. Sometimes a great actor director like Kenneth Branagh needs a different director to rein him in a little bit because he can sometimes allow himself as a director directing himself in a movie. Branagh can sometimes allow himself a little bit too much, room to act. But Oliver Wood directed this version of Othello, and he gets the perfect Iago performance, in my opinion. Branagh is charismatic and charming. He's obviously brilliant at delivering the dialogue. He seems likable to everybody that he's around. I mean, you can understand why people want to trust him, why people confide in him, and he just sinks his teeth into this role. He really steals the movie. Uh, don't get me wrong, everybody else is great in this film, But if you portray Iago correctly, then Iago should steal the production because he is a scene stealer. He is written by William Shakespeare to steal pretty much every scene he's in. So this Othello is a little more than 2 hours. It's not as long and as extensive as all those stage versions that I mentioned, but it is longer than the Orson Welles version. So it really does keep though to the spirit of the story of the Shakespearean text. Everything he includes are the most important scenes from the play. Really, I think very well paced. And by the way, filmed on location in Venice, especially the early parts. And instead of Cyprus, they filmed on some island that actually has a real castle, in sort of the Italian area. I don't remember where it was, but it's beautiful location, a real castle. The costumes are terrific. I mean, it just looks beautiful as filmed by Oliver Wood. And, Kenneth Branagh definitely gives the performance of that production, but he also gives my favorite Iago performance, and it's also my favorite performance that Branagh has ever given. And he's given some great performances. And Lawrence Fishburne, like I say, he equips himself very nicely. Look, he doesn't have to equal Branagh. It's hard to do that. Branagh's a more experienced Shakespearean actor. But the emotions of Othello are there. The drama, the presence, the nobility. Even brings a little something different because of his youth. So it actually is the closest, in my opinion, of the two actors being somewhat equal. And that's saying something considering how good Kenneth Branagh is. So there you have it. The only 6 versions of Othello that I've seen. I would love to see more. I hope someday PBS has a masterpiece theater production featuring a couple of awesome actors in those roles. But in the meantime, these are the major ones. And of course, I highly recommend the 1995 version with Lawrence Fishburne and Kenneth Branagh.